I'm going to be laying track on foam on Ron's Trains and Things right now. Hi, I'm Ron of Ron's Trains and Things, and if you'd like to see more model railroad tips, tools, and techniques, then be sure to subscribe down below and click that little bell icon so you can catch future videos. Well, I have been very excited over the course of the past few months to get all of the mainline track laid on the new expanded portion of my layout and to be able to run trains across the entire length of my layout for the first time in what is now 15 months. Well, it's been a busy summer, which meant a lot of delays in getting all of that done. I've had one section of track left to lay, about 14 feet on the upper deck of the new expansion of my layout, and I finally got that track laid this week. Now, this entailed doing something just a little bit different than I've done in my previous track laying videos, in that I'm laying this track on a foam base. I know many of you use foam for your scenic contours, and you lay track on top of that foam, and the questions arise as to exactly how to adhere that in a way that will hold it in place but not attack the foam. Well, we're going to talk about exactly that today as I show you how I laid this particular portion of track, and you're going to be able to see the first trains that ran across this new section to be able to connect the upper deck through the helix back to the lower deck of my layout. Well, that's enough explanation. Let's head on over to the layout. We'll show you exactly what we got done. This video is brought to you by Midwest Model Railroad. Now with 15,000 square feet and one-day shipping, they truly are your one-stop model railroad shop. MidwestModelRR.com. Link in the description. In most cases, I lay my track on cork roadbed on a subroadbed of plywood. On the upper deck of my new portion of my layout, however, I laid a half-inch sheet of extruded foam on top of the plywood for the sake of forming terrain. I usually glue my cork down with regular wood glue, but working with foam required a different adhesive. Now, many adhesives contain some sort of a solvent in them, and these will attack the foam. I also didn't want an adhesive that expands like Gorilla Glue. I needed an adhesive that was made for foam and that would adhere the cork well. Styro-Goo from Hotwire Foam Factory has been my go-to adhesive for foam scenery for some time. It works great, it doesn't attack the foam, and it can be cut with hot wire tools. I decided to try it for laying track. I will just say from the outset that it worked great for gluing cork to the foam. And for those who are gluing track directly to foam, I experimented with that, and the Styro-Goo worked really well in that application as well. With my center line drawn on the foam, I simply applied a strip of Styro-Goo to each side of the center line, spread it out with a bit of scrap styrene, laid my strips of cork roadbed on each side, lining them up on the center line, and pinned them in place with push pins until the glue dried. When I got to the transition onto the plywood subroadbed of the existing portion of my layout, I switched back to wood glue. I let the glue dry for about 4 hours and then removed the push pins. I then sanded the rough edges of the cork with a sanding block, sanded the top surface smooth, and vacuumed up the dirty bits. This section of track had only one turnout, a curved turnout leading into the town of Bowie, Texas. This turnout will have a tortoise switch machine, so I marked the location of the turnout and the position of the actuating rod. I drilled a 1/4-inch hole for the rod and installed the switch machine. Switch machine installation is a subject for another video, and we'll cover that sometime soon. With the switch in place, I started laying track. I started where the track ties into my new helix. It took just one section of track to connect the helix to this turnout. I took extra care to make sure that the turnout placement was perfectly aligned with the switch machine and that everything moved smoothly. I then moved on to the other end of the section where it meets the existing layout and laid track from there back to the switch. I did this because it would allow me to make my final joints in a straight section and not on a curve. I started by soldering two joints of track together so they would complete the curve without having to solder in the curve. I then shaped the track generally into place and pinned it down. Next, I soldered this track to the end of the trackage on the existing layout. Let me show you how I make my track solder joints. First, I typically do not remove ties at the ends of the joints of track. Instead, I use a chisel type number 17 blade in my hobby knife and cut away the spike detail on the last tie next to the joint. I then install rail joiners on both tracks and allow them to slip between the rail and the ties. I adjust the placement until I have both tracks straight and the rail joints are tight. I apply an acid-free liquid flux onto the outside only of both rails, making sure to get enough flux to coat the outside of the rails and to run down into the base of the rail joiner. I use this homemade mirror tool to help me see what I'm doing on the back side of the far rail. It is an absolute must. I then apply heat exactly at the joint between the two rails with my soldering iron for a couple of seconds and then apply a bit of solder. I've experimented with a lot of different types and sizes of solder, and I have the best results with this 0.8mm solder. I'll put a link to both the flux and the solder that I use in my Amazon pick of the week in the description down below if you'd like to check them out. Sometimes it's going to happen that you're going to get a bit too much solder on a joint. When you do, it'll leave a bit of a clump that can be kind of unsightly, and the best cure for this is a soldering wick. Simply heat the wick on top of the excess solder and it will remove it. I'll link the solder wick in the Amazon pick of the week below as well. I continued soldering track together until the entire section up to the turnout was pinned in place. Always check your solder joints with an NMRA gauge to make sure that the tracks are in gauge. Out of gauge tracks are a certain recipe for repeated derailments. I cut the last section to fit perfectly up to the turnout, and I installed the rail joiners on the flex track and slid them all the way onto the rail. I'll connect them to the turnout after the track is glued down. With all of the track soldered together, it was time to glue it down. I do this with latex caulk. Almost any paintable caulk will do, but I like to use a gray color as it blends in well with the ballast that I most commonly use. I lifted the track and set it aside on some risers, then glued it down with a latex caulk. When the track was glued down and pinned into place, I slid those rail joiners onto the turnout and soldered the last joint. After the caulk had set for a few hours, I removed the push pins. One last step in the soldering process is cleanup. First, I use some denatured alcohol to clean flux residue off of the rail joints. This residue will keep paint from adhering to your track. I scrub it away with an old toothbrush dipped in the alcohol. Then, this is the only time you will see me use a Bright Boy. The abrasive on the Bright Boy removes any left behind solder and contaminants from the rail heads. To heal any scratches left behind by the Bright Boy, I burnish the rails with a steel washer epoxied to a scrap of plywood. Finally, it was time to run my first test train. Now, I haven't wired this section yet, nor have I cut any insulating gaps for the electrical blocks, but I'll cover these steps in a separate video. For now, This section is simply drawing power from the adjoining blocks, which is good enough for a test. I ran this short test train out of the helix all the way through the section into Wichita Falls Yard. And then I pulled a cut of 17 covered hoppers out of Wichita Falls to make the needed trip down to North Yard on the lower deck. The track ran like a charm, and I am very pleased to have my main line fully connected for the first time since I started this expansion project well over a year ago. Well, I am thrilled to have my main line complete and connected again all the way from one end of my layout to the other. Now, I don't know about you, but when I'm working on the layout, I have a tendency to collect a lot of materials and a lot of tools, and to say that my layout becomes cluttered would be a huge understatement, and I think many of us have those same issues. Which means that now that I've got all of my main line connected, I'm going to have to do some cleaning up in order to be able to really run trains all the way across my layout. That's going to be my job over the course of the next week or so, and when I do, I'm going to bring you a video that kind of shows you exactly the state of my layout from one end to the other. Many of you have been asking for an update on my layout for quite some time, and I'm going to be bringing that to you in the next couple of weeks. Now, if you watch this video because you're interested in some tips on track laying, I've made an entire series of videos about laying track. Laying track on the main line or industrial sidings, laying curves, doing easements and super elevation, as well as laying curved track in my helix and some other videos similar to the one I made today. I have all of those videos grouped together in a playlist, and you're going to find it linked in the corner of your screen right now. You'll want to check that out to help in your track laying endeavors. Well, be sure and check out my Amazon pick of the week in the description down below, as well as my Micromark promo code that'll save you 10% at micromark.com, and tons of other great links. And if you'd like some more Model Railroad content right now, be sure and check out the links on your screen. And join me each Tuesday as I bring you even more great Model Railroad videos, and I look forward to seeing you then. 10, Lizzie?